Welcome back, everyone. As Lori discussed earlier this morning, we are so grateful for all of your support, particularly throughout the challenges of the past few months. I want to offer a special thanks to Dr. Jennifer Ligabel, to Joyce Zakum, and the many volunteers and donors who continue to support the Leonard P. Zakum Center for Integrative Therapies and Healthy Living at Dana-Farber. The Zakum Center celebrated its 20th anniversary in August with the home edition of their annual Music Heals the Soul event, and it was a tremendous success. As Dana-Farber looks forward, we wanted to take some time as we move forward in our program to highlight a few key priorities. In the upcoming sessions, you will hear two wonderful panels. The first panel will highlight the role of mentorship in helping to shape the extraordinary expertise that is a hallmark of Dana-Farber. Then, during the next panel, we'll turn our attention to the area of cancer prevention and early detection and some of the themes that we can pick up from the conversation with Nicola and Linda. During these segments, we encourage you to continue to submit questions for our presenters on the right-hand side of your screen. We've dedicated time to offer both panels time to answer questions. And without further ado, I'm delighted to introduce the first group of our panelists, starting with Dr. Bill Kaelin. Dr. Bill Kaelin received the Nobel Prize in Medicine in 2019. He is currently the Sidney Farber Professor of Medicine at Harvard Medical School. Dr. Kaelin was a clinical fellow in medical oncology at Dana-Farber and a postdoctoral fellow in the laboratory of Dr. David Livingston, who has also graciously joined us today. Dr. Livingston is the Emil Frei Distinguished Professor of Medicine and Genetics at the Harvard Medical School and the Charles A. Dana Chair in Human Cancer Genetics at Dana-Farber. He was a co-founder of the Dana-Farber Harvard Cancer Center and served as its deputy director from 2000 to 2019. Also joining this panel is Dr. Julie Losman. Julie is an assistant professor in the Division of Molecular and Cellular Oncology at Dana-Farber, and attending physician in the Division of Hematology at Brigham and Women's Hospital. In 2014, she started her own laboratory at Dana-Farber with Dr. Kaelin as one of her mentors. Also joining us is our chairman of the board, Josh Bekenstein, who you heard from this morning. He has graciously offered to moderate this wonderful discussion and panel. It is now my pleasure to hand things over to Josh. Good morning, Josh.
Morning. Thanks, Melanie. And thanks so much for all you and your team and everyone else has done to put this together. I think there's a lot of work every year getting the symposium together. I think it's more work this year doing it on Zoom. And I hope those of you that enjoyed the yoga, I know I had to do it because for sure, I think everyone gets a little nervous when you speak in front of people. I would say my level of anxiety is higher than normal trying to speak on Zoom. So we'll hope this comes out okay, and glad we're right after the yoga session. I'm really excited to host this panel. You know, at Dana-Farber, as I told you in the introduction, we're a 50-50 organization, you know, focused half on research and half on cancer care. And for me, the excitement is that when I talk to our doctors and grateful patients, I'm incredibly excited about the incredible care we give. But then when I get the opportunity to interact with our researchers, I'm so incredibly excited about the research that goes on. And this panel is with three fabulous researchers at Dana-Farber. So I'm super excited to have this opportunity. We're going to go with some questions in advance, and then if you have questions, please add them. We'd love to try to answer them later on. Anyway, just to get started, I'd love each of the doctors on the screen to talk a little bit about why you initially chose Dana-Farber as a place to work, and what's kept you here. All of you have been here for different amounts of time, but all for quite a while. And maybe, Bill, we could start with you, if that'd be okay, please.
Sure. Yes, so I came to the Dana-Farber Cancer Institute in 1987 to be a medical oncology fellow. Frankly, at that point in my life, I was convinced I was going to be a clinical oncologist. The only question was whether I was going to be in academia or in private practice. And if anything, I had been told when I was younger that I probably should not try to pursue a career in the laboratory. So I was completely convinced I was going to be a clinical doctor. Fortunately, the Dana-Farber at that time, and still is, I think, the best place to get your training to become a clinical oncologist. But I also knew that it was doing fantastic science, and I'm a big believer in not burning any bridges unless you have to. So I thought in the outside chance I later wanted to re-engage in science, I wouldn't have to leave. And secondly, I thought the great science at the Dana-Farber would make me a better clinician because it would inform the work I was doing.
Great, thank you so much. David, would you like to, I know, David, you've only been here a few years, so maybe you can, just mention like why you joined and why you stayed.
It's pretty simple, Josh. I started looking for a position once I finished my training at NIH in 1973. And quite frankly, there wasn't a depression or anything like it on in the United States, but jobs for young people like myself who actually like to do experiments and take care of people were hard to come by. Salaries were low, and upward movement was, or upward migration was rare. Nonetheless, I'm from Boston, and I love that fact. I love living here. My family has been here also for quite a long time, and they encouraged me to go see if I could get an appointment with Dr. Farber. I said, you got to be kidding. But nonetheless, it happened, and he was very gracious, and he picked up his phone and called a man named Emil Frei, who was the chief physician at the time. And Tom Frei, he's known as Tom, was known as Tom, invited me into his office, made some coffee, and we started to talk. And 2 hours later, he's a big talker, and I guess I like to use the same kind of principle. It was clear this fellow was special. He'd already discovered, before he came to Dana-Farber, how to use chemotherapy to cure certain rare cancers, leukemia in children, a few, and certain forms of Hodgkin's disease. And at the end of that, I thought I just was in heaven. One thing led to another, and he personally called me back 2 weeks later, offered a job, and I didn't think twice about taking it, and I've been absolutely thrilled ever since.
Thank you. And Julie, could you tell us about your story?
Yeah, sure. So my story is in some ways kind of the opposite of Bill's. I started working in the lab in high school. My mother is a pharmacist and pharmacobiologist, and I knew I wanted to do research. I did my MD PhD at Columbia, and then I went to Johns Hopkins for residency. And I knew that I wanted to be a basic scientist. I knew I wanted to be a physician scientist, but I had had a number of very different but very rewarding lab experiences. And I was not ready to sort of commit to a particular area of research. And even though I had been very happy at Hopkins, because I didn't know exactly what I wanted to do research-wise, what I really wanted was to go to a fellowship which would give me excellent clinical training, but would also give me the opportunity to pretty much do any kind of scientific research imaginable, and really sort of, follow my bliss. And it was absolutely clear when I was interviewing at different programs that the breadth and depth of research at Dana-Farber and in Boston more generally is just unparalleled. And I would essentially be able to postpone committing to any sort of, particular research field for a few more years until I had really grasped exactly what I wanted to do. And so that's why I came here, never regretted it. Trained in Bill's lab, had a phenomenal experience. And then really the decision to stay was ultimately a decision of, I was so happy and it had been such a good experience training here. I had the opportunity to stay, which was very fortunate, not everyone does, but it just seemed crazy to leave without having a good reason to. So in some ways, it was almost a foregone conclusion, I think, once I knew that I could stay, that I would stay, because it just, there was simply nowhere else that was going to offer me anything that would rival what I had at Dana-Farber.
Great, thanks. So Bill, I think that everyone is very interested to understand a little bit more about your research, and I know we could go on forever, but maybe you could briefly describe how you started your research and in what direction it went, and what your focus has been, and how it's affected the ability to treat patients better.
Yeah. Thank you. Well, again, I had the good fortune of training with David Livingston. So David's really the one who taught me how to be a scientist. And I did start my own laboratory in 1992. And amongst the most important decisions a scientist makes is, what am I going to work on? And from my clinical training, I knew about rare families that developed cancer generation after generation after generation because they were passing a defective gene from one generation to the next. And in this case, the gene has a name, and the scientists call it VHL for short. And I knew from my clinical training that the tumors that these patients developed were notorious for their ability to induce new blood vessels to form, as well as to stimulate red blood cell production. And both of those responses are normally seen if a tissue is not getting enough oxygen. And so it seemed that if we could study the VHL gene, we might learn about how normal cells sense oxygen, and we might also learn how various cancers hijack this system. And fast forward over the next 20 years, we learned that we were right, that the VHL gene is a critical component of the oxygen sensing mechanism. We basically identified the molecular circuit, if you will, that allows all the cells and tissues in our body to sense and respond to changes in oxygen. So, for example, if you or I went to the top of Mount Everest, the system would get activated and your body would respond to help it operate in a low oxygen environment. So based on this knowledge, we can now do a couple things. Now we do understand better how various cancers hijack this system, because cancers need oxygen too. And so, for example, this work, I think, helped accelerate the development of so-called VEGF inhibitors for the treatment of cancer. And now we have a new class of drugs called the HIF inhibitors for cancer. Conversely, there are a variety of human diseases, such as heart attack and stroke and others, where part of the problem is you're not delivering enough oxygen. So now there are other pharmacologic opportunities to re-engage this pathway to help normal tissues that are not getting enough oxygen. So basically, we have new tools to either make the system more active or less active, depending on the specific indication.
Great, thank you. So that leads to something I think we're all incredibly proud to be affiliated with Dana-Farber and the honor that you got. And I think it would be, I'm sure that I know I wanted to understand it better, and I'm sure our audience would love to hear a little bit more about sort of what happened. Maybe you can give us a flavor for that very exciting morning about a year ago, and sort of, what happens, and how you think about that. You've obviously had an incredible career with many, many, many other honors, but this one is something that's especially different. And so maybe you can help all of us get a feel for what it's like to receive a call early in the morning.
Well, thank you. So first of all, to give it a little context, so in roughly the year 2000, we discovered a particularly important and fortunately particularly pretty piece of the oxygen sensing puzzle, and I knew at that time perhaps this was the kind of discovery that would put you in the conversation for very nice prizes. But I always try to remind my trainees that the real prize was participating in the discovery and having the privilege of understanding something that hadn't been understood before, and then even more importantly, to watch that discovery over time start to affect patients. But nonetheless, I would occasionally allow myself to dream. And so every October, I knew it was Nobel Prize month. Someone asked me the night before the announcement whether I was going to be able to sleep. And I told them, well, I think realistically, my chance of winning is no better than 1%. But since it's not zero, I will go to bed with my cell phone at my bedside table with the ringer on. Now, the Nobel Prize Committee claimed that they actually couldn't find my phone number, and so they frantically found my poor sister, who was asleep and hanging at 4:30 in the morning, and they woke her up, and she gave them two phone numbers, and she's adamant that both numbers were correct, but the Nobel Prize Committee during the press conference mentioned that the first number they dialed was a wrong number. They got someone else in Boston, and I pointed out that in Boston there's a non-zero chance it could have been another scientist, but fortunately they did ultimately reach me at 4:40 a.m. And at that point, as I was listening, I almost couldn't listen because it was sort of almost an out-of-body experience. This is something that, as I said, you allow yourself to dream about in your weaker moments, but you don't actually think it's going to happen. And I was just flooded with a sense of what a privileged life I've had as a scientist, and how really lucky I've been. I also, once I regathered myself, thought about all the other people who made it possible. I've said it takes a village to win a Nobel Prize. And, you asked me what brought me to the Dana-Farber, but certainly what has kept me at the Dana-Farber is the fact that the people around me make me better. And I've already mentioned David Livingston as my mentor, but I've had countless interactions with colleagues who have generously whispered good ideas in my ear. And most importantly, I've had a steady succession of just incredible young people who are really the heroes in this story, because they're the ones who do the work. So that's what's kept me at the Dana-Farber. I did naturally reflect on my late wife, Dr. Kaelin, who was my best friend and biggest supporter over the years. She had died of a glioblastoma in 2015 after a very valiant effort. I've said that, for the first couple of years after she died, I actually would go to bed in October praying that I didn't win, because I didn't think I could stand to win it without her, but I'm in a better place now. So I like to think she's smiling. And in fact, I told you that it was in my weaker moments I would dream I might win the Nobel Prize, but Kaelin was certainly right about most things. And she was pretty adamant from the get-go that I was going to win the Nobel Prize, and wasn't bashful about telling people that her husband would eventually win the Nobel Prize. So once again, Kaelin was right.
Thank you so much. So David, you've also had incredible honor. There are very few Nobel Prize laureates in the world, and therefore very few people who've ever been able to be a mentor to a Nobel Prize laureate. And I believe you were at the ceremony, and I'd love to have you share some of your thoughts about your mentoring opportunities, and then what it felt for you like being at the actual ceremony.
Well, first of all, let me tell you just a little bit about what it's like having Bill Kaelin walk into your laboratory and ask if he'd like to work there, if he could work there. Well, within a month of the time he'd entered the lab, I was very well aware that this young man, who was the tallest scientist I'd seen for quite some time, was one hell of a young scientist in the making. He has an ability to take very complex arrays of information and ring from them understandings that are invaluable. So that's number one. Number two, I would recommend anybody who's invited to a Nobel ceremony to go. It's unique. It was, in my life, it was the most, I guess, enlivening experience I'd been to that didn't involve my own family. The prestige and the honor are certainly palpable, but to see Bill Kaelin in a white tie outfit to receive the Nobel Prize, the highest honor in all of medicine and medical science, was for me, an out-of-body experience, quite frankly, and for my wife as well. And to know that he had made discoveries that will definitely turn people's illnesses off in time. He's co-discovered and discovered by himself drugs that have the potential to do that. And he's quite a modest fellow, this, genius quality scientist. And it was, like I say, it was unique. I will never forget it, nor will I forget the honor of being invited to go.
Thank you. I would like to say that I know many of you in the audience have had the opportunity to interact with our fabulous, researchers and clinicians and nurses. One of the things that I find so incredibly charming about Dana-Farber is that, in my experiences around the country and around the world, I've never been around a more talented group of folks who are also so modest. I think, obviously, Bill Kaelin is our most famous researcher, but we have so many fabulous researchers, and I've never met anyone at Dana-Farber who isn't incredibly humble and modest about their incredible achievements. So it's something that I find incredibly refreshing and important about the Dana-Farber culture. Julie, obviously the fast-paced and fierce competition for funding for young researchers. and it can present lots of challenges. And I'd love you to speak a little bit about how mentorship and your mentorship from Bill and has impacted your career, and some of the challenges for young, brilliant researchers like yourself, and how that affects your career.
Well, yes, thank you for that question. I mean, I think that it is certainly highly competitive. I think it's highly competitive for junior investigators. Funding is highly competitive for senior investigators. I think it's a tough road for everyone. And the truth is that the pressure never really lets up. I think, Bill and David can speak to this too, that there's really no threshold of fame or success that you reach where all of a sudden you're just, you're rolling in money and you don't have to worry. I mean, I proofread and review Bill's grants, he reads mine, and so there's always pressure. The pressure's always there. I think as a junior person, you do have to kind of prove your bona fides perhaps a bit more. So there's a little bit less of, an assumption of ability until you've proven yourself. But I think that pressure is always there. I think the biggest impact of mentorship, I mean, obviously it's fantastic to have, a Nobel Laureate as a senior author on your postdoc papers. And there's no doubt that, my association with Bill has been incredibly helpful in terms of sort of legitimizing me as a scientist. But I don't think that that's actually the biggest impact of having him as a mentor. Really, the biggest impact is the training that I got in being a really rigorous scientist. And it's very funny. Sometimes we have these conferences and I raise my hand and I ask a question. And if there are other people in the room who know Bill, there's a little bit of eye rolling, like, oh, okay, that's the Kaelin in you speaking. Bill makes an enormous impression on his trainees. And I think it's a very, very lasting impression. And it's one that I think stands us in very, very good stead. So I think, mentorship is arguably the most important impetus to drive good science. And I don't think good science is something that you instinctively do. I think it's something you're trained to do by being surrounded by people who are incredibly rigorous. And I know that Bill learned that from David. I learned that from Bill. And my biggest ambition is to impart that to my own postdocs and my own trainees, because that's really the way to move the field forward. So yeah, I think it's been incredibly impactful. But the truth is, the Nobel Prize in and of itself has really been a secondary factor in all of that.
Okay, I think I lost it there for a second. Can you all hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, sorry. The challenges of the internet. Thanks so much, Julie. So David, one of the things, as you know, that we're incredibly proud of at Dana-Farber is that, we want to take advantage of 100% of the brilliant people in this world who can help advance the research and the care, and that includes men and women. But we all know that there is a lot written about the fact that we need to do more as a society to support and encourage women in the field of science. So I'd love you to share a little of your perspectives as you've seen throughout your career on why it's important to mentor women in science.
Well, first of all, a little history. When I arrived here in 1973, there was one other female faculty member. And one new female faculty member recruited, and there were 20 of us in total. Those numbers tell a big story. Secondly, that was true everywhere. That was true in almost every major medical research institution I was at, even the NIH, which is a federal institution and obeys laws that prevent people from discriminating against one another based on gender. So what I've seen in the last 25 or 30 years has been a literal flood of wonderful young female fellows, students, and now faculty, to the point at which it's clear to me that one doesn't need at Dana-Farber to think about gender disparity. There isn't any. In fact, our president is a woman for the first time in our history, and a great one, truly great one. And the spirit of Dana-Farber is we want to train brilliant young people like Julie Losman, and she is brilliant, I tell you that. I've seen it in action. And we also want to train her first cousin and her second cousin, who happens to be female, who went to Yale, and my daughter, who went to Yale, who unfortunately decided to become a lawyer. But the point I'm trying to make is this is now genderless business. Medical research has become increasingly genderless business. And in this city, in this beloved city, and in the country, Dana-Farber is in the forefront of institutions that have made that happen.
Bill, anything you'd add in your experiences with regards to anything special? I know that the numbers say we're doing a great job at Dana-Farber of having a lot of fabulous women as well as a lot of fabulous men on our faculty. Anything from your perspectives you'd like to add to that?
No, I do think we're doing much, much better. I think there's also just a greater appreciation of sensitivities about work-life balance, and some of those issues just do disproportionately affect women. But I think we've done a much better job. I actually had one postdoctoral fellow who gave birth to 3 children while she was a fellow with me, and I think that's a record that'll be hard to break. But you know, I think we've all gotten much more sensitive. I think they say the first step in solving or improving on a problem is to recognize that there's a problem. So as David said, we had a problem. I think there are multiple people trying to figure out how we can do things better, and I think we've made great strides. But there's always things we can do even better.
Thanks. Yeah, one of the things I was fortunate enough to chair the board committee that chose Lori, and I've known her for almost 20 years, and incredibly fortunate to have her in Boston. 4 of the 6 CEOs of the 6 biggest hospitals are female, which I think is great. I also know that in the times when we were celebrating Ed Benz on his retirement, one of the things I was really excited to see was that the female faculty got together and had their own thank you to Ed for his mentorship. Julie, I'm curious on your side, not just on behalf of yourself, but your other female colleagues, any perspectives you'd add about how we're doing at Dana-Farber to try to make sure we're really supporting all our faculty.
Yeah, I think the numbers speak for themselves. I think the numbers are improving. I don't think they're where they need to be yet. But I think that David is exactly right in the sense that I don't think at this point the problem is an institutional one. I think the institution takes the hiring of women and the support of women very seriously. And I think Lori has been very dedicated to that. I think where the lesion still is and still needs work is the pipeline. And when you see the number of PhD and MD and MD PhD postdocs who start in the lab, the attrition rate among women is just a lot higher than it is among equally talented men. If you look at the number of first author high impact papers, I think the number of women first authors are probably equal to the number of men. And yet there are a lot of women who just, for whatever reason, and there are a number of different pressures that cause that to happen, who end up not being able to follow through and end up with a lab-based research path career. And I think there are a lot of things that still need to be addressed. I think, the work-life balance that Bill mentioned is a very important one. The length of time of training and the competition between that and a woman's natural biological clock, those are very real issues. And I think there's still work to do to address them. But what I will say is I've now been at Dana-Farber for 14 years. And I would say that I've really never encountered what I would describe as an institutional limitation on my own development. Whatever limitations there have been are much more structural and much more societal. And I think that's probably true for most of my women colleagues. And unfortunately, the women who should be my colleagues, but who unfortunately decided on a different path because they hit roadblocks.
Thanks. So for the audience, and I don't know how many of you are technologically able to do this, but we would love to answer questions. We've had a few come in, but I'm about to ask the last question. So you have a minute or two, if you could, to get more questions into the queue. I'm going to ask each of our doctors here one final quick question, and then we'll go to audience questions. So I do suggest for any of you who can figure out the technology and have a question, please send it in and add it to the list. The last question that I'd have for each of you is that I'd love to ask each of you to share the most pivotal leadership lesson that you've learned, either from a mentor or something that you've learned that you now teach your mentees. And we'll go from our most inexperienced first. David, maybe you could start this since you're sort of new at this.
Yeah. So I learned science first from a medical school professor named Morris Friedkin. He was a very genteel, rather quiet, but absolutely given expert on the subject of how you so-called control an experiment. How do you know a result you got is meaningless and not garbage? How do you know the difference between it looks great and it isn't even close? And what I found from him in repeated examples in his lab, which he would teach orally at the bench, was that knowing the difference and how to find the difference between reality and seeming reality was everything. And he would sometimes walk up and show us data, and the data were wrong. And the only way you could figure that out was to ask enough questions so that you became rigorous, that's the word, rigorous enough to almost never, if not never, no one's perfect. So let's just make it clear. We are not perfect individuals, scientists, but we try to asymptotically, that means get real close to perfect by doing what we call controls. And the person who's called Mr. Controls at Dana-Farber is Bill Kaelin. He's given lectures on this subject, I would say, in many foreign countries even, and we should let him talk to you about that as well.
Well, now, Josh, you're starting to see the chain, because David mentioned his mentor, David mentored me, and I mentored Julie. But you know, there's an old joke that the best predictor of winning a Nobel Prize is having trained with a Nobel Laureate, and there's a reason for that. You know, I think I stupidly thought the hardest part of science was learning the techniques. That actually turns out to be the easiest part of science. But as David said, the hardest part is designing an experiment such that when you do the experiment, you can get an unambiguous answer from that because of the power of the controls that are embedded in the experiment. So that's certainly one of the important things I learned from David was that rigor. I would also say there's something else I learned from David, because another important thing, as I mentioned, is what are you going to work on? And so I talk about scientific taste and scientific instincts, and being around great people, you get that, it gets imprinted upon you. And David imprinted upon me his unbelievable nose for a good question and where some great discovery might lie. So those are some of the things I learned from David.
Great. And Julie, it's interesting because obviously within this group, you know, you're the least experienced, but you're actually quite an experienced and quite an accomplished researcher. I'm interested with being at Dana-Farber 14 years, any perspectives you want to add on either things you've learned from mentors or things you've learned as you start to probably transition into more mentoring than being a menteed?
Yes, well, I mean, I could certainly reiterate everything that David and Bill just said, and that's not an accident. It's because, you know, we are imprinted by our parents, our intellectual parents, as well as our biological parents. And David is in some ways my scientific grandfather in the same way that Bill is my scientific father. But I think the sort of the leadership question, or I think one of the takeaways that I took from training in Bill's lab, I remember very distinctly, very early on after I joined the lab, one of the postdocs in the lab was presenting a almost completed story. And it was a really beautiful piece of work, and he was going through the figures and explaining his research. And then he came to the final slide, which was future directions. And in the future directions slide, he outlined a bunch of very straightforward, in some ways kind of obvious questions, the next step. And whenever during lab meeting, Bill gets a little antsy or a little frustrated, you can hear a little tapping, and the pen starts, and he starts grunting a little bit, and he suddenly starts shaking his head. No. He said, no, once you publish this paper, those experiments will be done. They will be done by other people. He said, we're not here to do things that are easy. We're not here to do experiments that are obvious. He said, with the resources of Dana-Farber, with the intellectual and scientific and financial resources of an institution like this, we are here to do the hard thing, the not obvious experiment. And that really struck with me, because what he ultimately was saying was that we have a responsibility, not just an opportunity, but a responsibility to really push the envelope research-wise. And I really took that to heart. And I think especially when you're starting out, you want to balance ambition and also, reasonable success that you can demonstrate so that you hit the benchmarks that you need to when you're starting out. But I really took that to heart, and I've really never wanted in my own lab to be viewed as an incrementalist. And I think that when you ask a really interesting question, a really important question, and you study it very carefully and use controls that David talked about, that I think you can really make really dramatic advances in a way that I think a lot of other institutions don't necessarily give their faculty the opportunity to do. And that's really what I've tried to impart to my own trainees, is to think big, because we can. And because we can, we have to.
Thank you. I hope I haven't lost this. Okay, Bill, I guess one question for you. Sometimes people talk about taking risks, and I'm curious if you could maybe talk a little bit about, what kind of responsibility we at Dana-Farber have to take, strategic risks within our research portfolio, meaning, research things that maybe others aren't, or do things that other institutions don't have the opportunity to do.
Yeah, dovetails very nicely with the conversation Julie was just having with us. I think especially when money gets tight, people get very conservative, and they do experiments that are very safe and obvious, and I would even say in some cases almost self-fulfilling. And you could use various metaphors, but some people refer to these experiments as sort of stamp collecting or laying bricks. I mean, they will work, they will be publishable, but they're not going to transform a field. They're not going to shatter a paradigm and completely change the way we think about a problem. And I heard a quote that's been attributed at least to Isaac Asimov, and the quote was that the most exciting phrase in science, and the one that usually heralds a major breakthrough, is not eureka, it's that's odd or that's funny. And when money gets tight, people sometimes are afraid to follow that unexpected result because they don't know where it's going to take them. But again, time and time again, the major discoveries start that way. And so I think it's really important that we support our scientists, especially our young scientists, to feel like they have a bit of a safety net. And if their instincts, and I referred to instincts earlier, tell them that unexpected result is worth following, that they follow it. Because again, time and time again, those are the kind of initial pieces of data that lead to fundamental changes in the way we think.
Thanks. Unfortunately, I'd love to have this conversation forever, but I'm being told that we're supposed to be done here in a couple minutes. So I'll try to do a wrap up here. Number one, I just want to really thank our three incredible doctors and researchers here. It's interesting. I've been riding the PanMass Challenge for a long time, and back in the 90s, before there was email, I used to send my requests for support by text, or by fax. Remember those old fax machines? Because that got people to read it instead of a letter, and it generally worked. And one time, a friend of mine faxed something back, said, "Josh, to know you is to owe you." And then COVID really hasn't affected me much, because when I walk down the street, for like the last 20 years, everyone gets out of the way because they're afraid I'm going to ask money for Dana-Farber. So I've been socially distanced for a long time from sort of anyone that was afraid of me asking. But I do have to put in the pitch here, which is that it is incredibly exciting, the fabulous researchers we have at Dana-Farber, but this work can't be done without all the support that all of you in the audience provide. I hope all of you feel incredibly excited and proud that you have helped Dana-Farber have these 3 individuals and many more like them on our faculty. But I'd also say that if we want the next, young David Livingston or young Bill Kaelin or young Julie Losman to be at Dana-Farber, we need your continued support, especially for young researchers. I think it was about 1995 when David Nathan told me, he said, Josh, please don't tell any of the senior faculty this, but for your first major gift, if you would focus it on, if you and Anita would give it to young researchers at Dana-Farber, I'd like that. I can say this now because hopefully David's okay with it, but he said, don't tell any of the senior researchers I asked this because they need and want your money as well. But he said, young researchers at Dana-Farber is really important and not enough people support it. So on behalf of all the researchers at Dana-Farber, thanks all of you in the audience for all you do to help support this work. I can promise you in all the time that I've been at Dana-Farber, I've never for a moment felt like we didn't use every dollar as best as we could. So, I promise you that these faculty and the rest of our faculty use your money incredibly wisely and do incredibly exciting things. So I hope you've enjoyed hearing from them. I hope you want to hear from them more in the future, and I hope you'll do anything you can to support them. Obviously, it's incredibly exciting what's going on. So thanks very much. And Melanie, we'll turn it back over to you.
Josh, thank you for facilitating that wonderful conversation live today. And Julie, Bill, and David, thank you so much for sharing your personal stories and reflections. I can't imagine what it must have been like to try to find a phone number for the Nobel laureate, and I'm so glad that the Nobel Committee was able to track you down, Bill. The themes from the panel, humility, excellence, rigor, and the responsibility we have to push research forward are truly inspiring. And the power of our community, which is our theme for this year's symposium, is so apparent in the conversation we just had. I think I was one of those people like Josh who could have had that conversation go on for much longer than the 45 minutes. Dr. Kaelin's extraordinary contributions to the field and our community make us all so very proud, and we're delighted that we had David and Julie with us to talk more about their community. I really want to make a few comments here. We had a question from, or actually a comment come in from Dr. Diane Fellows, who added to the chat, all of our esteemed panelists, you are all rock stars. And to all of you, thank you for the great questions that came in during that panel. As we transition to our next live panel, we'll take a short break for about 10 minutes. And should you choose, you're welcome to enjoy the musical talents of Dr. Doug Brandoff. Not only is Dr. Brandoff a palliative care physician at Dana-Farber, but he's also a Juilliard trained pianist and cellist. Dr. Brandoff's performance is from our own Yaki Center for Cancer Care, and we'll see you all in a few minutes for our next live panel.